Okay, so following up on this last video, what we saw is that educational trends out of the end of World War II produced a situation where all of the upper class vocations began to put together or further implemented programs where, in order to be considered a profession, there had to be an extensive educational process followed by professional certification by the professional organizations in that area. Now, a couple of the fields where you can see this process happen are in the field of accounting and in chiropractic, and then later you can see it with acupuncture and some of the other forms of natural medicine. Now, what happened here is this. Take accounting. The old-time kind of accountant became called a chartered accountant. Now, a chartered accountant is somebody who went through the process the old-fashioned way, which was to say not necessarily primarily through taking educational courses and getting an MBA, but they learned the field, so it was a kind of a hands-on approach. What happened in the field of accounting is, as they went through their process of professionalization, is they did a grandfathering, which is that they recognized that all the previous chartered accountants, as long as they kept their certification current, and as long as they followed the new rules, would be considered to be the equivalent of the new form of accountant. And so what you got later was the CPA, the Certified Public Accountant. And as you saw this kind of process take place in a number of vocations. Now, as I mentioned, what happened with astrology was a completely different path. In the 1960s, astrology began to become very popular in what we could call New Age circles. And that was people who used it personally as a tool to understand themselves, their families, their relationships, so forth. And they realized the power of astrology. And the thing was, of course, they had no educational alternative because astrology was not being taught in the universities, or at least it was not being taught in the educational side of the universities, because later on, going into the 70s, universities started to set up things like community outreach programs and community learning centers, and their astrology might be taught, but not really for academic credit. So what developed out of this is these astrologers of the 60s and 70s started to form their own organizations, and out of those processes came the organizations that we know today, such as National Council for Geocosmic Research, ESAR, and AFAN, although these organizations weren't necessarily just populated by flower children. So anyway, what these organizations then developed a few years on, as they attempted to work out their own organizational missions, is NCGR, for example, took education as a major component of their system, and ESAR took professionalism. Okay, well, what was this education and what was this professionalism? This was all taking place before the formation of Kepler College and Avalon School of Astrology, which at this point are the only two astrological education organizations that actually have some form of governmental status. Kepler is authorized by the state of Washington to give higher education degrees, and Avalon School is authorized by the state of Florida to give vocational degrees. Okay, well, it was before this, so what was the education? Well, the education was the same kind of, let's call it what it is, avocational or hobby-type education, which had been taking place at that point. Now, please understand, I am not attempting to insult that educational process. I taught that way myself. And what happened was there were no universities to teach, so what did people do who wanted to learn astrology? They read books, or they went to a course that was being offered by somebody who already knew how to do astrology. So what you had was this grassroots educational process that in many respects was and is very good. The thing is, it's not the kind of educational process which fits into the modern definition of the term profession. And this is what I really want to address here, is that the use of the word profession as it is being done by astrological organizations at this time isn't wrong, it's archaic. It's a use of profession that really only applied before the 60s or the 70s, when all of what are now the professions were going through this process of getting their education into a college curriculum and then getting their certification into something that was done after somebody had this college education. And this is the problem, that what you have is a group of extremely earnest, extremely learned in one sense, astrologers who are practicing a craft that they take extremely seriously, that they have tremendous passion about, but they're not doing it in a form that anybody who is outside the field would recognize as a profession. So basically the problem is this. Personally, I've been listening to these discussions of the profession of astrology for well over a decade, verging on 2. And what everybody then talks about is the schools of astrology. And, okay, well, we've got to get this kind of training in, and we've got to have training in history, or we've got to have training in ethics, or we've got to have training in counseling school, or whatever the particular piece is. But this is thinking from the past. This form of profession doesn't exist anymore. Frankly, as far as our current educational system is in astrology, the outside world can at best see us as a vocation, not a profession. But that's not how we think of ourselves. So this is where things need to break down, because we have a breakdown in the fact that the word profession has moved on in its definition, and we as astrologers cannot control that general community definition. So as far as the way we are using it, we are now wrong. I understand where everybody's coming from on this, but we can't buck that trend. So if we wish to be a profession in the way that society views a profession, we're going to have to play by the rules, and playing by the rules means we have to set up systems of education, educational structures that fall into what society recognizes as being the acceptable modes, which means colleges, which means authorized vocational institutions. Now, what if we don't do that? Fine. We go on being astrologers, but we'll have to acknowledge that what we are doing is not being professional. So if we want to be professional, we have to accept that the rules have changed. Otherwise, we're going to keep having these discussions about the profession of astrology, and 20 years from now, the discussion is not going to be materially different than the discussion is now, because nobody has been willing to bite the bullet and change the way we do things so that we can be recognized in the form that we want to be recognized. Otherwise, we just keep having the discussion and nothing will change.